Now let us discuss a short story, A Cup of Tea by Catherine Mansfield. And let us work out the strategy for understanding, analysis, and interpretation. Consider the historical and cultural context. Draw inferences on what you have read. Get engaged with the text and apply various strategies. Identify the narrator's voice. Identify deeper implications insightfully from the text. Focus on literary and language meanings. About the author. Catherine Mansfield played an important role in the genre of the short story. She is recognized as innovative and psychologically acute, one of the pioneers of the avant-garde in the creation of short story. Her influence on other writers throughout the 20th century was immeasurable. She is regarded as one of the most talented writers of the modern short story in English. Her language is clear, sharp, and precise. She is a central figure in the development of the modern short story. Noted 20th century literary criticism. An early practitioner of stream of consciousness narration, she applied this technique to create stories based on the illumination of character rather than the contrivances of plot. Virginia Woolf admitted that Catherine was the only writer whose writing she was jealous of. A number of writers, among them Aldous Huxley, borrowed not only her words but also her character for their novels. Catherine Mansfield was born in New Zealand. She came to England at the age of 19, and all within 7 months of her arrival, she had several love affairs. Her unconventional lifestyle embarrassed her family and resulted in her mother cutting Catherine from her will. Subsequently, she lived on her own and had numerous love affairs. Her life was somewhat unconventional for the times in which she lived. She became a much more complex person, sexually reckless and socially excitable. She is characterized as courageous, contradictory, self-willed, single-minded, and argumentative in both her life and her work. Catherine, along with her sisters, was educated in London. Although she studied at the Royal Academy of Music, she soon realized that writing was her true calling. Soon after her marriage in 1918 to John Middleton Murray, a literary critic and editor, she became a virtual invalid of tuberculosis, and she died in France in 1923. Her stories depend more on atmosphere, character, and effects of language than on plot and can be found in collected stories of Catherine Mansfield. And now let us deal with cultural and historical context. The beginning of the 20th century was a time of great change due to technological advances, scientific theories, and capitalism. The 1920s saw enormous political and social disturbance throughout Europe. The period between the two world wars, the new Soviet Union, fascism. The First World War compounded this disturbance. Society was left fragmented and disillusioned, and the modernists felt that the traditional mode of representing the world in literature, specifically realism, was outdated and no longer appropriate. Irving Howe, in his famous book, The Idea of Modern, remarks, "Modern writers find that they begin to work at a moment when the culture is marked by a prevalent style of perception and feeling, and their modernity consists in a revolt against official order. At the beginning of the 20th century, writers broke with all traditions and conventions in the writing. Between 1910 and 1939, modernism was the most important artistic movement. It is defined as a breaking away from established rules, traditions, and conventions, fresh ways of looking at man's position and function in the universe, and many, in some cases remarkable, experiments in form and style. So one should distinguish modern from contemporary. The contemporary refers to time, while the modern refers to style. And just a few words about the story, A Cup of Tea. Rosemary Fell, a rich woman, goes shopping and walks into Miss Smith, a poor girl who asks for money for a cup of tea. Rosemary decides to help the girl, as she feels inspired by the stories by Dostoevsky that she has been reading. She drives her to her house. There the girl starts sobbing. The tea and food is brought in. She eats while Rosemary smokes. Then Philip, Rosemary's husband, comes in and has a talk with Rosemary in the library. He conveys his disapproval, but Rosemary resists. Finally, Philip tells her he finds Miss Smith pretty. Jealous, Rosemary gives 3-pound notes to the girl and sees her off. And now let us do some reading between lines. Rosemary Fell was not exactly beautiful. No, you couldn't have called her beautiful. Pretty? Well, if you took her to pieces. But why be so cruel as to take anyone to pieces? She was young, brilliant, extremely modern, exquisitely well-dressed, amazingly well-read, in the newest of the new books, and her parties were the most delicious mixture of the really important people. So what does this description tell about Rosemary? Try to discuss. If Rosemary wanted to shop, she would go to Paris, as you and I would go to Bond Street. If she wanted to buy flowers, the car pulled up at the perfect shop in Regent Street, and Rosemary inside the shop just gazed in her dazzled, rather exotic way and said, "I want those and those and those. Give me 4 bunches of those and that jar of roses." What information does the author communicate to his readers? No, no lilac. I hate lilac. It's got no shape. The attendant bowed and put the lilac out of sight, as though this was only too true. Lilac was dreadfully shapeless. Does the author want to tell something by this detail? Charming. Rosemary admired the flowers. But what was the price? For a moment the shopman did not seem to hear. Then a murmur reached her. 28 guineas, ma'am. 28 guineas. Rosemary gave no sign. She laid the little box down. She buttoned her gloves again. 28 guineas. Even if one is rich. She looked vague. She stared at a plump tea kettle like a plump hen above the shopman's head, and her voice was dreamy as she answered, "Well, keep it for me, will you? What do you think? Does the author want to tell something by this episode? "Ma'am," stammered the voice, "would you let me have the price of a cup of tea?" A cup of tea! There was something simple, sincere in that voice. It wasn't in the least the voice of a beggar. "Then have you no money at all?" asked Rosemary. "None, ma'am," came the answer. How extraordinary! Rosemary peered through the dusk, and the girl gazed back at her. How more than extraordinary! And suddenly it seemed to Rosemary such an adventure. It was like something out of a novel by Dostoevsky, this meeting in the dusk. Supposing she took the girl home, supposing she did do one of those things she was always reading about or seeing on the stage. What would happen? It would be thrilling. And she heard herself saying afterwards, to the amazement of her friends, I simply took her home with me, and she stepped forward and said to that dim person beside her, "Come home to tea with me." In your opinion, why does the author mention Dostoevsky? What influence does Dostoevsky have on Rosemary? What can be Rosemary's true motives in inviting the girl home? "And let me help you off with your coat, too," said Rosemary. The girl stood up, but she held on to the chair with one hand and let Rosemary pull. It was quite an effort. The other scarcely helped her at all. She seemed to stagger like a child, and the thought came and went through Rosemary's mind that if people wanted helping, they must respond a little, just a little, otherwise it became very difficult indeed. And what was she to do with the coat now? She left it on the floor, and the hat too. What do you learn about Rosemary from the above episode?